They say, as the family goes, so goes the nation. And although that saying is true, statistics show us that as the father goes, so goes the family. With this in mind, you would think that many churches would prioritize strategically targeting and reaching out to the men in their communities. However, many men feel completely alienated from the church and would rather find their support from the godless Manosphere or red pill movement. So, why is the church failing men so badly? On this episode of Forge and Anvil, we will venture to guess. All this and more, so stick around. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations about culture, theology, and politics to sharpen ourselves for the race set before us. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. I am a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ Jesus, just doing my best to represent him well each and every day. If you are consuming this podcast, we are actually not live, although it will say that we are live. We actually pre-recorded this podcast because I am taking the night off, but I appreciate you guys jumping in the chat anyways, and feel free to communicate with each other in the chat, and maybe if I get a chance, I'll jump in myself as well. It does help us out, though. But I am joined once again by returning guest Will Spencer from the Renaissance of Men. So, Will, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Happy to be back, Connor. My name is Will. I'm the host of the Renaissance of Men podcast. I'm a Christ follower, inveterate Christ splainer, and you can find me causing trouble on Instagram and Twitter and YouTube at renofmen.com/links.
Perfect. Before we get started, feel free to jump on over to our Substack. That is forgeandanvil.substack.com. That is our new home where you can find all of our podcast episodes as well as different writings from yours truly. There is some exclusive members-only content as well. So there's a free tier that you can just sign up to just be a part and get our communications. And then there is a paid subscriber tier as well for those of you who have the means. We would really appreciate it. And we'll check out our daily show in the van, nearly daily. It's kind of just whenever I can afford to do it, but it's just quick segments where I cover politics and cultural updates for you guys who can't handle the full length episodes. Be sure to share and like this video. It helps boost us in the algorithms. Follow us on Twitter at ForgeandA for additional content and updates on the show. And be sure to post this wherever you are on social media. I really appreciate it. But I'm going to go ahead and just jump straight into our topic here, Will. So we're talking all about specifically men within the church. I actually saw this tweet from Smash Bales on Twitter. He talks all about how godly fathers are crucial to leading a family to Christ. And he posted a graphic that says, when dad comes to Christ first, 93% of families will follow. And then it shows the other statistics. So when women, the wife comes to Christ first, 17% likely that the family will follow. And when children go to Christ first, it is 3.5% likely that the family will follow. And he does go ahead and post the article for further details there. So if you guys want to find this original tweet, in case you think he's pulling that statistic out of thin air, he does cite his sources. But I thought this was really interesting because 93%, I mean, that's huge. But it seems like in our modern day, we only ever see these massive family church pushes from most local churches to try to get kids into the door. They always talk about kids being their target demographic, and then of course women as well. So it seems like an obvious logical error on behalf of churches in terms of their evangelizing based on that statistic. And we can go into the article and get more details if you'd like, but what's your initial thought on why it is that these churches are not reaching out to men? Because I have my suspicion, but I'd love to hear your take on it.
Because strong men step on people's toes, and they want to have more people in their church, but they don't want to disrupt anything. They don't want anyone asking questions. They don't want anyone being like, excuse me, you just had a woman leading a prayer there. You have a female pastor coming in, and it says right here in the book that we're not supposed to be doing that. Men have a tendency to do that. And so a lot of churches have very little to no incentive to bringing in men who will rock the boat and demand, if they know to, doctrinal purity and clarity. So it's easier to appeal to children and families, and an appeal to children is an appeal to primarily, I think, probably to wives and husbands who will follow them. That would be my guess. Versus like, here's a husband reading a Bible with his wife and kids around, like very clearly the center of the photograph. Let's say the stock photo. Men, do you want to lead your families like this? That would be something to appeal to men, rather than like, our church is kid friendly. Say, well, kid friendly isn't necessarily always man friendly.
Yeah, well said. I think that is definitely, I think that you're onto something with that. I think another, my suspicion, when you look at statistics of spending habits of the household, oftentimes the wife is the main decision maker when it comes to what they spend their money on. And again, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. Obviously, there are exceptions to this rule. We're not trying to say that every church is falling into these fallacies, but I would not be shocked, especially in the last several decades when we've seen this push for church growth, that so much of the churches have focused in on the member of the family that ultimately decides where their budget goes. I mean, you can talk all day long about how men make the money, but it's been shown many times over that women are the ones that do the bulk of the spending. And that just makes me wonder if that's a church growth strategy, whether intentional or unintentional, because ultimately the higher ups know that their tithe money is ultimately going to come through permission of the wife. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I went to Google real quick. And just to look up some statistics, and this is on girlpowermarketing.com. So this is favorable. So women in global spending. Women control over $31.8 trillion in worldwide spending. This is catalyst.org 2020. Women in U.S. spending. Women make up more than half of the U.S. population and control or influence 85% of consumer spending. So like,
there we go.
And so of course, that's a really good insight, that it's who truly controls the purse strings in the family, and how can we bring in more money for the church? Yeah, I think you might be onto something as well. Men would demand more doctrinal purity.
It's interesting that you pulled that up too, because I knew that the statistic was high, but I didn't have it memorized, and 85% is a lot higher than I had even remembered it to be. Yeah. And I'm sure you can find other resources that maybe say it's 60% or whatever, but either way, that it's very clear that women still hold the purse strings, as they say. So at the end of the day, I don't doubt that there is pastors who are, they're scared that they're not going to make their paycheck, and so they're going to cater to the women and the children, because ultimately the women are oftentimes swayed by how, to your point, kid friendly the church is. How many activities are the kids getting to be a part of every single week? Do they have a great youth group for Johnny? Do they have a great children's group for Sally? And I really do think that is ultimately what women look for. In fact, my wife and I have had this conversation multiple times, because we moved not too long ago. And when we were looking for churches, we talked about this, because actually it's a little known fact for most people in my audience, but I went to school to be a worship pastor. That's pretty much what I did for my undergraduate degree. I was not someone that thought college was for me, but I did feel a calling to go to this college, and that's a whole other story for a whole other time. But ultimately, my wife and I, as we started to explore churches, as we are married and moving states, and I constantly was drawn towards these churches that had gaping holes in their staff structure and that needed some serious help. Whereas my wife constantly wanted to go to the church where they had everything taken care of. They were fully staffed. They had a children's pastor. They had a preschool director. They had, every single I was dotted and every T was crossed. And we had multiple discussions where we kind of realized I'm drawn towards a church that needs me, that needs help. And ultimately she is drawn to a church that is going to take care of of what she views as her needs.
Hmm.
And that's all. I honestly think that that's a great insight to men and women and how they view churches. Not because my wife is necessarily incorrect, nor am I. You could argue that there's some sinful mindsets behind both of those desires, and there's also some good ones. But either way, that distinction between her and I really was insightful, and I just wonder how much of that plays into this dynamic of men and into them not being reached by churches.
That's an incredible insight, because as I've explored different churches, one of the things that has been really important to me is a church that I can contribute to in the ways that I'm uniquely skilled and interested to contribute. Like, where do I fit if this is the man that I am, and these are the things that I'm passionate about? Is a church willing to, to disciple? They have the resources to do that. So I've, again, like, I'm relatively new to the faith. I didn't grow up attending church, so learning about the whole church world has been very new, and so that resonates with my experience. And I can also understand, because I go to Apologia, and Pastor Jeff Durbin gave a sermon this week, and where he mentioned, we have family integrated worship. So families and children are sitting in the sanctuary. There's no breakout room for kids. And he had said that when they planted Apologia Church, that they got really strong advice from other church planters, like, no, you shouldn't do that. You have a separate room for kids. You'll kill your church growth and all that. And I was like, that's interesting that they would say that it would kill your church growth, because I remember when I first started going to Apologia and all the kids were there, I'm like, this is great. Like, of course, yes, children scream and they cry and they get fussy, and I get that. And some moments it's better or worse than others. Like, that's fine. But for me, as a new believer, walking into the church and seeing these big families there was like, this feels like what church and Christianity should be. So I can understand also why that would be something that a woman would be sensitive to in a different way. Like, will my children be taken care of? Are there services and ways for them to participate? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And it ties back to, why is the pitch being made to women, and why is the pitch not being made to men?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting that you brought up family integrated worship, because that is actually one that my wife and I discussed many times over. We visited multiple churches.
Many times over.
Many times. We have visited multiple churches that did family integrated worship. And ultimately, the church that we go to right now does not. They do have separate children classes. But we have decided for ourselves that we are going to do family integrated worship. So we actually bring our children with us into the service, even though we are definitely in the minority. We're not the only ones. There's a couple of other families that do that, but we still have that same mindset. It's like, this church is great, but in this one area, we're just not convinced that our children shouldn't be sitting with us in the pews. And so we bring them every Sunday. And, sometimes we're those people that disturb the service because we had to get up for a potty break, or we had someone didn't take a good nap before the service. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's like, exactly, definitely me. But but at the end of the day, are the children part of the church?
Yeah.
Or do we need to segregate by age and segregate by experience of how long they've been walking with Christ? And I don't think there's any biblical argument for that. And so we've decided to do family integrated worship for ourselves. And I'm curious, Will, because we're obviously we're focusing in on how the church is failing to reach men. So do you think that there is something in the male instinct that wants to see families worshiping together as opposed to the segregation, or is it just maybe a aversion towards the public school system that that youth groups were modeled after? What do you think is causing that?
I don't know. I don't know that if I were to try and extend my own personal perspective to other men, I would say that similarly to what appealed to me about a place that I can serve is the feeling of being in an environment of responsibility.
Hmm.
Meaning, like, I walked into the sanctuary and I see big families, and I recognize that, like, wow, you're going to have kids sit through a church service. That's a responsibility on the man, on the husband, to maintain order, right?
Hmm.
To raise his children well, to keep things under control, to be present. It's also the assumption of responsibility of, like, I'm making sure my children get raised in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. A display, like a man displaying the size of his family, is also a way of displaying his ability to provide, right? That could be another thing. And, like, you come into a church and it's like, this is how we do this. We honor families. And I think that where the red pill manosphere dialogue really goes super wrong is it only talks about men in terms of the fulfillments of their desires, money,
Hmm.
sex, like money, sex, power, wealth, all those things together. And that's not what men are for, right? There are manly things that men do, but that's very different from talking about what men are for. And what men are truly for is leading a family, is providing for a family.
Hmm.
That's what God made us to do. And so walking into a Christian environment and seeing families shows me what God says men are for. And so, like, oh, I can be a man here, right? Because this is what it speaks to me on that level. I couldn't say whether that's why it would appeal to other men, but it probably wouldn't be too far off the mark.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because we keep talking about this idea of being needed, and
Mm,
a good friend of mine, we were having a similar discussion, all about wanting to feel needed by the church, and he said something really wonderful, and unfortunately, I won't be able to quote how he said it, so I'm just going to do my best to paraphrase it. But he essentially said something to the effect of, um, I always felt this desire to be needed by the church, but I kind of realized that was sort of me wanting the church to, kind of like focus in on me and making me feel this need as opposed to like me just jumping in where I could. And I don't disagree with the heart behind what he's saying, but so I guess I'll pick your brain on this. But how do you thread that needle between? I think a man should feel needed and he should feel that responsibility from a church, but not in a way where it's making it all about him. And I
right,
should feel needed because I'm hot stuff.
right,
But at the same time, when he feels like he's just one very replaceable cog in a machine, some of these churches, their volunteer options are like, yeah, go run cameras, and if you're sick on a Sunday, oh well, we just won't have camera C that day, or Ted will just take your place, and they feel very replaceable. So how do you thread that needle between not wanting to be narcissistic about it and overly self-important, but also recognizing that there's probably a good desire for wanting to be needed?
right. Yeah, I mean, I look at it less. Yeah, I think it is a naturally good responsibility for men to be needed and not necessarily wanting to be celebrated for it. So if a man says, I want you to need me and I want you to celebrate how important I am, that's a very different thing than, like, hey, this is what I'm good at. Please put me to work because I want to contribute. I
Hmm.
think it's a godly desire is to put our skills. Now, if you start expecting to be celebrated, then that's clearly it's about your ego. It's not about your competence, right? So if a man leads with, hey, I'm competent man, put me to work. I think that's completely valid of any organization that a man walks into, as long as he's willing to pay his dues, right? Like, you don't just expect to show up and, be given some position of power. Like,
Right.
you're just like, just put me to work in a particular way. That isn't like grunt work, right? Because I think you
Right.
can get enough, like, young kids, teenagers, who'll do simple stuff like that. Men who have responsibility, there's a degree of humility that needs to be shown, for sure. Like, you take what's available, and if you're an organization that's not set up to recognize and recruit talented, competent men into roles that require talent and competence, your organization isn't going to get as far as it could. And that's the thing is, but again, like, talented, competent men, they're not desirable in our society anymore, period, except for when floodwaters rise. Then they want all the talented, competent men. The
Hmm.
rest of the time, sit
Yeah.
down, shut up, and check your privilege. But when we're in an emergency, then man up. By the way, I did a tweet about this. Toxic masculinity and man up are like gas and brake pedals that
Hmm.
women use to control men. So if you
Hmm.
need a man to be super masculine, you say, okay, man up. But then if it's too much, like, whoa, 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 toxic masculinity. So those two terms are used to control men's expression of their masculinity in culture. And so that's just my own little pet thing.
Yeah, women
So
of both genders
women
will use that.
yes, and but that's the thing is like organizations, as I started out saying, they don't want competent masculine men to come in because they might start rooting around and see that things aren't run the way that they should be, or
Hmm.
maybe they'll start saying that like, hey, like again, this isn't in the book. Where is this in the book? Oh, rocking the boat. You know what I mean? So in general, it's unfortunately, and this is true for many organizations in America, not just churches, there is a disincentive to bring in competent men because competent men demand that things are done competently.
Right.
And, one of the, you know, a lot of great ministers are not great administrators, and
Hmm.
things are run on shoestrings and corners are cut and all this different stuff. And it's, again, the same byproduct of like why we got here as a society in the first place, because we stopped prioritizing competent men throughout this civilization. And so it's kind of a sticky situation to be in.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Manosphere because you mentioned it earlier, and you obviously have a history with the Manosphere more than most people. So I think you could give
Yeah.
some great insights to, any pastor that might listen back to this episode, because the Manosphere is the $20 question that everyone is asking about within the church.
Mm,
How come men are so attracted to people within the manosphere, the Andrew Tates of the world, or the Jordan Petersons? Not that he necessarily would call himself manosphere, but some
right.
people put
He's
him in that category.
Manosphere adjacent for sure.
Yeah, manosphere adjacent, exactly. They wonder, why are these men attracted to them, but they're not attracted to their local pastor. So maybe give us a little bit of background to your history of the Manosphere, because I know you recently put out some tweet. I think it was with Michael Foster, saying how you're thankful that Michael Foster left the Manosphere, but you said something to the fact of you were kicked out of the Manosphere.
It was.
So tell us a little bit about that background to give some credibility to what you're saying, and then maybe let's try to pick at that question.
Sure. Okay. So the super short version is I discovered the world of masculine personal development in 2013 through an organization called the Mankind Project, which did men's initiations. So a lot of inner self work, very psychological, psychotherapeutically focused. I was into that work, very inward focused, not outward. I was into that work for about 5 years until I discovered the Manosphere through YouTube. And then I discovered there's this whole world called the Manosphere, excuse me, which is very focused on men's outer lives. So it's not so much about fear and guilt and shame. It's more about like muscles, money, status, sex, stuff like that. Quote unquote, improving men's outer lives. And so I looked at these two halves of the men's personal development world, and it's like these two halves aren't talking to each other at all. Why aren't they talking to each other? Because I had been greatly blessed by both. And so I went into, so when 2020 came around is when I started the Renaissance of Men podcast, a big discussion around that. I had just become Christian, but I hadn't yet really discovered how much Christianity had to say about masculinity. But I started interviewing all of these influencers within the Manosphere in 2021. I did this cross-country road trip to do 25 interviews with Manosphere influencers. I drove 14,000 miles, got 60 hours of footage, and I got to meet all these guys. So consequently, in 2021, I was invited to speak. In 2021, I was invited to speak at the 2021 convention, the 21 convention, the largest Manosphere convention in Florida. When I went to this convention, I brought like 10 guys with me, which was like a significant portion of the attendees. We were the center of attention the entire time. And it was really cool. We were the center of the social life. It was really, really great. I was a big fan of what the Manosphere was doing. That's also where I met Michael Foster for the first time.
Hmm.
But then in early 2022, the founder of the 21 convention, a man named Anthony Johnson, started posting on Twitter sort of insulting things about Jordan Peterson and Kevin Samuels, who was a big deal at the time. Professional men that, again, not Christian. I hadn't yet figured out things related to Christianity the way that I have now, but but men who were professional, put together, clean cut men that were making contributions. And all my guys are like, what is this guy, Anthony Johnson, talking about? And so my guys all pulled out of the conference because they're like, and then he started slandering Christ as well, which was a big part of it. And so my guys pulled out of the conference and asked to have their $2,000 tickets canceled. because they did like, we don't owe this guy $2,000 to go, pay somebody who's insulting our values. And so as a result of that, after a long phone conversation where I tried to reconcile with Anthony, like, look, these guys don't owe you their money. He banished me from the Manosphere formally, sent me a letter, kicked me out, and said if I were to show up on the premises at the convention, that I'd be escorted out by security. So, and Anthony Johnson is the quote unquote president of the Manosphere. That's his Twitter account. So I was officially kicked out of the Manosphere by the president of the Manosphere in May of 2022. And so that tweet I was referencing because I wouldn't like bow the knee. I'm like, look, I'm not going to tell you that these things are okay. We live in a free country with free association. He's a libertarian and he's an Ayn Rand objectivist. It's like words have consequences. So I was slandered in public and I was slandered in private, and that's still going on as a result of all that. But because of that, I was thrown out of the Manosphere. And honestly, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me, because over the next 18 months, every single man in the Manosphere has had almost every single one has had a significant personal tragedy that revealed there was more to their story than met the eye. Right. And it's been a real shame to watch a movement that was very good at helping men discover what it meant to be a masculine man. All these guys held themselves up as gurus, like, I'm the ultimate man. And you find out before too long that they're really not. And that's been the major flaw of the Manosphere, is that and Manosphere adjacent men, whether you're talking about Jordan Peterson or Andrew Tate or whoever, is you have men that are holding themselves up as icons to be worshipped, for men to model themselves after, and these men become the standard. And rather than pointing to a standard beyond themselves. And it was through being in the Manosphere and trying to find where masculinity can root itself in a transcendent way beyond evolution that I was ultimately able to really see the message of Christianity, God the Father and his Son, that God made them male and female. That is rooted in creation and God's eternal decree, that God is a he. Masculinity has a transcendent rooting. It's not just evolution. And so this was why I became so enthusiastically Christian. One of the many reasons, because everything that I've been looking for in terms of masculinity in the Manosphere, I found in Christianity and in Christ. And so getting thrown out of the Manosphere was a necessary pruning that I had to go through. It was painful. It was difficult. I don't like seeing my name dragged through the mud, but at the same time, getting thrown out was an enormous blessing. And Michael Foster stayed in for quite a long time, trying to lead men in that world to Christ. There's an ongoing effort to do that, but ultimately we both have kind of decided that, like, well, at a certain point you have to let the ship go over the falls. And so that's kind of what's going on. And tragically, it's harming a lot of men as it falls apart. But that's sort of my experience in the Manosphere, getting to meet a lot of these men, getting to go to their homes, meet their families, shooting my documentary, speaking at conventions, having personal conversations, making friends with them, being betrayed by them. And so I have a long history of experience in the Manosphere that came to an end quite painfully, but it was providential as well.
Yeah. And I think because of that, though, I mean, and you're probably going to be quick to say the same thing. You now have an insight that I think is going to be so impactful to the church. Because to your point, you got to see these men who wanted to put themselves as the standard, and none of them can bear that weight. And that's the whole point of the church, is we have the only perfect man who walked the face of the earth. And he reigns forever on the throne, at the right hand of his Father. And so, ultimately the church has the answer. It's just a matter of how can we reach these men. So let's talk about what the church is doing right now that is preventing them from reaching these men, because that's the question. These pastors are saying, we have the answer. Well, why are these men seeking out Andrew Tate and not their local pastor? So maybe just start there. What kind of things are you seeing, on a broad level and maybe an individual level from pastors and churches?
Well, if you don't tell men what they're for, all you can really do is tell men what to do. So men are for being fathers, husbands, fathers, protectors, providers, and the priestly role, right? That's what men are for. In order to tell men what they are for, you have to tell women what they are for, which is to raise children and make a home. Otherwise, it don't work. And so if you won't tell women what they're for, because you're afraid of offending the spirit of the age, which is feminism, which is in the water and it's in everyone's bloodstream. If you won't tell women what they're for, then you can't tell men what they're for. And so all you can do is tell men what to do, which is to man up. And you know what? Pastors, fat pastors, or pastors in skinny jeans don't tell men what to do as well as Andrew Tate does. So I'll go listen to the guy who tells me what to do authentically, who has the things that I want, because he does the things that I want to do. And these influencers lead men right over the cliff, all because pastors will not tell men what they're for, because they fear telling women what they're for. And that's why we're here.
Yeah, that's well put. I mean, the reality is, I actually saw, I think it was on your podcast actually that I saw Douglas Wilson, and he was talking about the difference between like a Father's Day sermon and a Mother's Day sermon. And the Mother's Day sermon, it's usually all about, how we should all be so grateful for our amazing moms, and we should call them today. We should respect them and honor them. And then the Father's Day sermon is usually 10 things you could be doing to be a better dad or a better husband or a better man, and it's usually so corrective in nature, whereas the Mother's Day sermons are so much more they're just so much more congratulatory, I guess would be the word. And so obviously I'm not again, we're painting with broad brushes here. Not every pastor is guilty of this, but I truly could not imagine a church having a sermon where they talk all about the things that women could be doing more of, or things that women could be doing better. And the reality is, we don't want to start a sex war in the church, but there is some degree where we have to look at areas of neglect from the pulpit and ask ourselves, does our pastor preach fully on this or fully on this? And if so, why not?
Yeah, there are a couple sermons that I can recommend where you will hear pastors preaching on this. One is John MacArthur, The Grace to You YouTube channel. The number one most watched video of all time on Grace to You is "Can Women Be Preachers?" 3 million views on that one, and you will hear it's like 4 years old. You will hear a pastor go hard on this subject. It was like, wow. And the comments, of course, are turned off. And then I can also recommend Toby Sumter's Biblical Marriage series. It's like 7 or 8 lectures that's on Canon Plus and on YouTube as well. And actually, I have an episode with him coming out this coming Friday, and you'll hear these two pastors very boldly, very bravely saying what women are for. The Biblical Marriage series is, of course, much more direct about what men are for as well, because we have our God ordained roles. So it's a little bit broader picture with Pastor Toby's series because it's longer, but certainly there's some bracing clarity from John MacArthur, and he has earned the right to speak on these things over many years. His position is secure when, frankly, there are so many pastors just trying to cobble together, I would imagine, some sort of congregation, and they recognize, whether in their home, their household, their family, their congregation, that feminism is the diet that everyone has been steadily fed on for 60 plus years. Again, it's in the bloodstream, it's in the water, right? And so pastors have an innate understanding that if they were to truly speak up against the spirit of the age, they would crack their church in half, maybe even crack their marriage in half. And so, look, I have enormous respect for pastors that are doing a good job, that are pinned in this position, because I imagine that there are many of them. And look, I don't want to be like, I don't consider myself one as a voice that's crying in the wilderness. Like, that's not what I'm saying here. But ultimately, I believe that all of America's problems, almost all of them, can be traced back to feminism. And so that will have to be the spirit of the age that America confronts. The country might not survive. Your church might not survive. Your marriage might not survive. This is punishment for generations of faithlessness. And yet we need strong men to be able to stand up to this and do it the right way. And I would love to hear a Father's Day sermon where a pastor gets up there and says, we're going to talk about how great fathers are today. We're not going to breathe a word about mothers. We're going to talk about how great fathers are. And that I would love to hear that sermon. And yet I can imagine that there would be women in any church in America that would get salty hearing that wouldn't be able to celebrate the glory of fathers, that would somehow take it personally. And that's a real indication of where we are, because we can celebrate women and their contributions. We can't celebrate men. Then when we get some women would love it. I don't mean to say that it's like 100%, but there are some that be like,
of course,
why are we? Yeah. Like men are crap. It's like, you call yourself a Christian, right? Tear out that root of bitterness, Book of Hebrews, and this is tolerated. It's allowed. And, it's everywhere in culture, and it's inside churches. We talked about Satanism not too long ago, witchcraft. Again, it's all manifestations of the same thing. I would also like to hear sermons talking about this is how women sin against their husbands, by rebellion. This is the John MacArthur sermon. It was like, whoa, he went there, right? This is how women sin against their husbands. What if we were to reverse it? Like, we can't speak to women the same way that we speak to men, which is a part of the issue. That in order to speak to women clearly and directly, you have to be, as a man, hyper-verbal. Men are generally more physical, intuitive, right? Or more like thoughtful in terms of they have longer, slower thought processes, which is not a bad thing. Women are more quick and verbal. So you need a man who can speak at that level. But imagine a man getting up there and saying, doing a Mother's Day sermon like he would do a typical Father's Day sermon. Mothers, we're going to talk about your sins against your husbands and your children. There would be a riot. Riot. And so we can see right there that there's a double standard there. And the double standard in as far as I can tell in Christianity is always an indication that something is wrong. And so I think these sort of double standards will have to be confronted lovingly in the months and years to come. And like COVID, the churches that do it successfully are the churches that will thrive. It won't be pretty at all, but I think it has to be done. And the last thing I'll say is, I think that there are women that want this to be done, that are recognizing that because of previous churches or their own fathers or upbringings or whatever, that they've been allowed to run too far, too wild, and they've caused damage in their lives, and they feel the sanctification within themselves, and they feel the gift of salvation and God's grace and mercy, and really have a true change of heart. And like men, they want to be convicted of their sins. And I think pastors have an opportunity there and to really create something beautiful if they're courageous enough to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, obviously we're already committing multiple thought crimes, and we're going to be labeled misogynists for having this entire conversation, but
drone strike inbound.
Right. Exactly. Drone strike inbound. Take cover under your desk.
Can I speak to that real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So if anyone, really truly believes me to be committing thought crimes and that I'm a horrible racist, sexist, misogynist, I invite you to please go to renofmen.com/links. And you can go to my YouTube channel, or you can go to my podcast, and you can see just how many interviews I've done with women. And you can listen to all of those interviews. In fact, of my top 5 podcasts, most downloaded audio podcasts of all time, I think 3 of them are women. And you can see that the women that I speak to enjoy speaking with me. We have great conversations, and there are a significant number of women who listen to my podcast as well. So it would seem that there are lots of women out here that don't believe I'm committing a thought crime. That simply that I'm saying things that they want and need to hear. And that is super encouraging to me.
Right.
Yeah. So I just wanted to
and that's exactly where I was going with that with that sentence is we're going to be accused of these things, but it's anecdotal, but I actually see people I'm going to use Twitter as an example, because that's where so many people that are going to consume this podcast, they're online, they're content creators or content consumers, and there are many people, thought leaders of online women's movements, that have been saying things like, yeah, watch these feminists. If they just meet a traditional minded guy, they're going to change overnight and it'll
Mm-mm.
be so good for them.
Yeah,
Or, I see these women that are saying like, okay, man, you want to blame women for all your problems? Well, step up and lead. Either way, there's varying degrees of how they're wording it. But ultimately, the result is still that there are these women that are actually asking men to lead. And
right.
so if you are a pastor that is scared to confront these things, first of all, I think we should remember that yes, your church might suffer, and you might lose people if you speak boldly on issues relating to gender. But to go back to the very beginning of the podcast, it's pretty evident that if your goal is to reach men, you're going to reach the family a lot faster than if your goal is to not offend women.
And more effectively.
Exactly. And so ultimately, like, what do you want to do? I mean, is your goal seats in the pew, or is your goal just going to be, the amount of tithe money that you're bringing in? Because sometimes you might not be able to have both, and sometimes you might get both. Actually, if you're just, if you're blessed and you speak boldly, I think that God does reward boldness. Um, so what other things can you think of, Will, that like what can the average local pastor do if we're just talking a little bit more individually? What can they do tomorrow to start reaching men in their community and dragging some of these men away from these disastrous manosphere type movements that are damaging so many people?
Yeah. Let's see. I'm going to read you a letter. This would be really cool to put up, let's say, on a billboard.
Hmm.
And I think it'd be really cool. Let's see. Ephesians 5:22. Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. And then we'll go, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. I don't know. I would say that you could probably start preaching that whole section to men and women and put it on a billboard, because if you want to start drawing away from what the Manosphere guys that tell men what to do, get fit, get rich, get laid, right? These are things that men do, right? They're godly desires that are being perverted. The desire for a man to get fit is a desire to ultimately have the capacity to protect. The desire for a man to get rich is the godly desire of a man to provide. The godly desire of a man to get laid is a godly desire to procreate. But these men that are just telling men what to do are just wasting it into the ether. Get laid with random hookups, get rich so you can buy sports cars, get fit so you can take vain photos in the mirror. It's fruitless pursuits, right? But they're godly desires that are being perverted. So the first thing that pastors have to do, I think, is start talking about what getting fit, getting rich, and getting laid really means to a man, what he's supposed to do for a husband and a family. That's what it's for. That's what those instincts are for. That's why God gave them to us. And guess what, ladies? Your turn. These men here, these young men, and sometimes not even all that young, this is what they want to do for you. And I bet that there's a similarly godly desire within you to nurture and raise children that your mothers and your fathers and your friends have told you is bad and wrong, and have tried to remove
selfish.
it, or selfish, and have told you to try to remove it from you. And you need to bring that to the cross. And then we'll start putting the pieces back together. But you're not going to get the men back unless you start offering to them a vision of something that they want, which might not be sin. It might be virtue. But you're not going to be able to get the men back by offering virtue unless you quote unquote, offer them women. And you're not going to get the women back unless you hold them to the sin of feminism that has wrapped its tentacles around their hearts and their minds. You have to start speaking into this. And yes, you might lose your church. Yes, you might lose your marriage. I'm sorry. Like, right? I've lost family members. Like, how much do we care about the gospel will be the real question. And again, for pastors listening, I don't mean to make this sound easy. I'm not like sideline cheering, but I'm just telling you how it is. And like, if you want to see a future for the American Christian church, that future is going to come from babies. And you know where babies come from, right? Otherwise, it's just going to die. And will you wonder whether you could have said something? And do you have the strength and courage to see it through? I pray that you do.
Well said. Yeah. Well, before we wrap up, I wanted to throw out at least a couple resources. Vodi Bakum wrote 3 really good books, all on the family and the husband, the father's role. That was Family Driven Faith, What He Must Be If He Wants to Marry My Daughter, and Family Shepherds. I believe he wrote them in that order. That's the order that I read them in.
Okay.
And I believe I coincidentally ended up finding out that that was the publishing order. And I would really say that all those books flow really well into one another, because he does kind of pick up where he left off in some of those. If nothing else, start with Family Driven Faith. I think that one's a great overview for biblical family ordering and biblical family worship, and that's an amazing place to start. But that was also that's a very accessible book for churches. If you're a pastor, maybe wanting to start just a Wednesday night group or something like that, or with the men of your church going through a book, that would be a great one to start. And of course, What He Must Be If He Wants to Marry My Daughter is all about how you can essentially vet a man to see if he's good enough to marry your daughter as a biblical father. And it, of course, helps the father of a daughter, but it also helps us, a father of a son, to know this is the kind of man I need to be raising, so that he can actually get this girl who is properly raised in a biblical worldview. So that's another fantastic resource. And then Family Shepherds basically just continues on focusing in on the husband and father's role. So those are some great books that I would recommend. There's many others that I could go into, but I'll keep my list short for now. But we'll go ahead and wrap up here. But feel free to throw out any additional resources that you'd like as well, and tell people where they can follow you.
Yeah, I really like the book No Mere Mortals by Toby Sumpter. That's a marriage for men and women that are going to live forever. I really like that book. That's something I'm working through. Disciplines of a Godly Man is another excellent book that I've been working on lately. In fact, the men in my men's group are working our way 2 chapters at a time about the various, again, disciplines of a godly man, about offline Christianity. I do want to say one word of advice to fathers. I think you recommended the book What He Must Be. What He Must Be was written, I have Amazon right here, in 2009. So right now the book is 15 years old. And so I'm sure it's a fantastic book. And it's probably still very relevant. However, one thing that fathers today really need to understand is that there has been a long-term systemic deprioritization of men and their needs. So you will find that between a man and a woman of equal age, even in their 20s, that the man will often be far behind where the girl is at. This is borne out statistically across the nation, that even little girls, like families that adopt, they prefer girls. And you ask fathers, you ask the survey, like which would you rather have, a boy or a girl? Fathers today generationally have preferred girls. So it's been a general throwing away and a general neutering of society against the qualities that make men outspoken, confident, and strong. Because we're raising men that work in nice corporate environments, not who hunt, not who make, who build, who fight with each other. We've been generationally raising men that fit nicely into like cogs in the machine. And so men have lost their edge. And so a father may naturally be looking for a man of a certain quality to marry his daughter. I mean, you might be looking for a real long time to find that guy that meets all of your qualifications. Women certainly are. So I encourage fathers, when they meet a woman's suitor, right, to look on him, perhaps maybe pity isn't really the right word, but to look on him with a bit more sympathy than you might otherwise be tempted, and ask, not is he the guy who can do the role, but could he be the guy that can do the role with my help? Because he may not have a father. and he might be otherwise a good guy. He might be worth an investment of your trust. And you could say as much to him if he's the man that you hope he can be. Say, son, I believe that you have the capacity to care for my daughter, and I would like to help you with that. And you have to be very judicious in your mentorship of him, of course, because there's all kinds of leaving and cleaving stuff that can come in contact with. However, to be generous to the men of this generation and recognize that they have had a lot that they were deprived, a lot that's been taken from them, and they've internalized a lot of guilt and shame. And you may have to help guide them through that. So that's the last thing I just wanted to say. If you'd like to, for anyone listening, if you'd like to find out more about me and what I do, you can go to renofmen.com/links. There you can find my podcast, and you can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter at renofmen.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate your heart, Will. And coincidentally, that was actually in the book as well. A lot of what you're saying there of men actually coming alongside the potential suitor for their daughter and really helping them to level up is in the book. And, that just goes to show that there's definitely a biblical worldview behind that book. So yeah, definitely check that out, and check out Will's podcast. It has been a huge blessing to me personally. So feel free to follow Will wherever you can find him. But thank you everyone for listening. We appreciate it. Feel free to go to our Substack, forgeandanvil.substack.com. We appreciate you joining us for free, or if you feel like doing a paid subscription, we would appreciate that as well. But we will see you next time.